Hey class, welcome to the next week's lecture. So last two classes we started to define the major distinctions that were turning the United States into basically two different countries, two different social systems, two different economic ways of life, right? They're still interconnected in good and terrible ways, right? There are a lot of Southerners who are kind of trying to pursue the idea of an independent existence. But of course, this comes with questions of slavery. And then you also have like the massive slave plantations linked to the development of not only industry in the North, but also the financial complex that not only insured slaves, but you could take out a mortgage and so on and so forth, right? Banks, slave trading companies, they were run out of the North. At the same time, the South is gripped with levels of anxiety, not so much because the North is the one undergoing much more industrial change, but still the South sees some kind of upheaval about people trying to find new ways of life, right? As we saw with the history of Mormonism for the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? This could go through a whole gamut of small movements linked to charismatic leaders that are communes that move from state to state, trying to figure out what's the true church, what's the true belief, how should we live, and what the future of America is, right? So at a political level, most of this stuff doesn't actually kind of reach out or cause too much problems. I mean, if it does, it's at the very local level, right? Like the Missouri Mormon Wars in 1838. Um, but at this point during the 1850s, national politics at the federal level, right, in Washington D.C., in Congress, in the presidency, at the judicial branch, right, it's starting to reach a breaking point, right? Which way will the United States go? Can the United States can exist in such a way where it has a slave plantation South and a free North? And increasingly, Northern powers, industrialists, some financiers, right, as we'll see, they start to think, no, right, we do not want to live like the South. In fact, we will start promoting policies and pursuing policies that limit the power of the slaveocracy, as sometimes they said it, right, the slave power, the plantation owners. So we'll see how this crisis comes to a head. Now, first, I want to get into the concept of free soil because this is the main thing as a term, right? This is an important term you want to mark down. It's really key to understanding the changing elements of the era and why the North starts to decisively turn against the South, right? Especially through the same prism, through the same lens that motivated them to be ardent supporters of Andrew Jackson. And then also for some people, Martin Van Buren. Now, the idea of free soil, right, as you might expect in the name, is about literally freedom of the soil, right? The idea that slaves do not work soil. Only free men work the soil, right? The idea that you should have a farm without slaves. So you can only own as much as you personally and within your own family and within your own kind of network of people. That's only as much as you can work, right? And that kind of limits. The idea is that it limits how much power you as an individual can have. So I want to draw a little example, right? All right, so you have a plot of land, right? It's divided up into 4 different sections. All right, it's not equal, but yeah, forgive my drawing. Okay, so in the free soil scheme, the basic limits of a person, right? One person gets one land, this guy, Y gets another land, Z gets land, and A gets land, right? So 4 people for 4 plots of land because the plot is about as much as one person, humanly speaking, can actually work, right? So that limits how much land you can actually own. The idea being, right, this little chunk of land can accommodate 4 different people, right? What happens if you have slaves, right? What if you get slavery in the mix, right? So this plot of land can settle 4 different people, 4 families comfortably, right? But if you have slaves, say farmer X, he moves in and he's got 3 slaves. So Farmer X can work this land. Farmer X's slave 1 can work that land. Slave 2 can work that land. Slave 3 can work that land. So Farmer X can have 4 times as much land than than he was previously capable, right? Why? Because he owns other people. This allows him to sort of get farther than an individual farmer would otherwise be able to get. And so at the level of economic democracy, right, and the idea of Jefferson were, again, Jefferson owned slaves individually, but that's not the point. Jeffersonian ideas, the idea of forming an America on the vision that Jefferson promoted, was about self-ownership, not ownership plus slaves. And what did slaves contribute to the free soil farmer, right? The corruptibility to gobble up more land than you should normally be able to have, right? The idea for the free soil party, the basic issue is that you should not own more than you're actually capable of using, right? You shouldn't just buy up land and then just let it rot. No, land is there to be used, and if it's not being used, it should be given to someone else. So the Free Soil Party, they're not anti-slavery in the sense of they want to abolish slavery, but they are anti-slavery in the sense that it should no longer be allowed to expand, especially in the territories that the United States was rapidly acquiring. So for David Wilmot, right, when he puts forward his proposal, the Wilmot proposal, to make sure that Texas and all other land that the United States acquires from its war with Mexico, to make sure that all this land, Texas included, would be free territory, was out of the question for the slave South, right? But that was the free soil position. Wilmot was a Pennsylvania Democrat. He was a free soil Democrat, right? Worried about the growing power of the slave faction within his own party. Now, how does this play out in the United States? So there's a sense where in 1848 we're going to get to and why this is relevant for America, but 1848 is a big year in world history, especially European history. But I think it has ramifications for the whole globe over. Right? 1848 was a year of revolutions throughout Europe. Germany, which wasn't a country at this time, it was made up of a couple different countries, but many different countries that would make up Germany and other German-speaking parts of Europe, they have these revolutions. France undergoes a revolution overthrowing its monarch, right? So to give a brief history, Napoleon, right? He sort of settles the French Revolution. He's appointed dictator for life, president for life, basically. Then that transitions into an empire where Napoleon crowns himself king of the French, right? Or emperor of the French, really, if you want to get the title right. But he declares himself royalty. Napoleon is defeated. He has a disastrous war with Russia where a huge chunk of his army is defeated outside of Moscow, right? And he can't keep going, so he retreats. His army's in disarray as it's trying to retreat from the Russian cold. A coalition of European powers led, kind of first among equals, by Great Britain, defeats Napoleon. He's ejected. He goes into exile. He comes back and gets control of an army, but then he's finally defeated a second time at the Battle of Waterloo. After this point, right, it's 1815, Napoleon's finally in exile. The old monarchy is restored. Now, if you want to understand French history or European history, right, they try to turn the clock back, right? They say, okay, right, the French Revolution was a mistake. We got to make sure nothing like this happens again. But you can't put the genie back into the bottle. So social reforms, right, the effects of which you could collectively call as a political program liberalism, which I won't get into all of that, which is a fascinating topic in itself, but you can't put all this stuff back in, right? So France goes through what's called a July monarchy, where the one monarch is overthrown for another monarch, but he's much more open to liberal reforms, free trade, less government kind of interference in the marketplace, the idea that there are these natural laws. Anyway, the 1848 sees that monarchy removed. Instead, France goes back to being a republic. And all throughout Europe, new republics are being formed. Monarchies are being overturned. The old order is being rejected once again in the spirit of the French Revolution. And in Great Britain, there's a very similar movement, right? Not drawing on the French Revolution exactly, But there's a movement of people who want to reform the law and society within England, and it's called Chartism. We won't get into all of that. But suffice to say, 1848 sees all these revolutions happen, and most of them fail. The rebellions throughout Germany and Austria are put down, they're crushed. In Great Britain, Chartism loses out, right? There are some massacres of demonstrators at a few key points, but Chartism kind of runs out of steam. And then in France, the Second Republic elects Napoleon's his nephew, who goes by the name of Napoleon III ultimately. Now, Napoleon is only elected president under the Second Republic, but like his uncle, Napoleon will declare himself president for life and then eventually crown himself emperor, and he will become Emperor Napoleon III. And we're going to hear more about him in the next lecture. He's actually kind of important to understand some of the dynamics of the Civil War. But all that to say, that's all kind of going on in Europe. And some people are fleeing to the United States when these revolutions fail because the United States seems to be a good harbor for these kinds of revolutionaries who are basically trying to pursue a country or form of government somewhat like the United States. Now, all of this is all going on in Europe, but most American textbooks, right, we don't talk, there's no revolution in 1848 or anything like that. But I think there's a way of kind of understanding a similar movement. The United States has been undergoing similar kind of democratic changes. It's not quite revolutionary or not so antagonistic to the government like Chartism is in Britain or in some of these other revolutionary groups in other European countries. But the US is going through this Jacksonian change. And so there are groups that are popping up. There was a group called Young America, which was supposed to be similar to Young Turks, Young Italians, Young Germans. There are a variety of other movements, and they were nationalistic. They wanted to kind of defend their nation and the ideas that made it great and pursue greater citizen involvement in government, right? Government's not just for elites, it's for the common average man, and his opinion counts. He should be able to voice his opinion, and he should be able to find a place for government for him, right? So there's something similar what takes place in the Democratic Party in 1848. Now, this is where the term free soil really takes off because this is the dawn and then the rapid eclipse of the Free Soil Party. Now, the Free Soil Party was basically built around the principles that I explained. Now, and the Free Soil Party itself is basically an offshoot of the Democratic Party. Now, there's questions on whether the Free Soil Party was just supposed to scare the Democratic Party or if it actually thought it could kind of create a new party system. And there's probably some truth in both. But basically what happens, a number of Northern Democrats, right, Democrats who are more skeptical about slavery, they want greater labor reforms, they want greater democracy, not only in the political system, but just a more democratic society that's more open to the average man, that's against corruption, that a government that works on behalf of the common person. A lot of these Northern Democrats in states like New York are totally disillusioned at the party conference in 1848, right? Their candidates get locked out, right? Martin Van Buren is still around. And he's very pissed, right? Martin Van Buren is the great compromiser. He's trying to hold the country together under one Democratic Party. So he's willing to work with slave owners, right? Van Buren himself is not super keen on slavery, but he doesn't really care that much. But he knows it's important for the South, and the only way the Democratic Party can survive is if it holds together North and South. But there are many people in the Democratic Party, like the sort of wily John C. Calhoun, who thinks the future of the Democratic Party is in becoming strictly a slave party. This means the interests of slave owners are the paramount issue for the party platform, right? Everything else is secondary. So, therefore, the Democratic Party should represent the interests of the South, but also all those in the North who then benefit from slavery as an institution and perhaps are willing to sort of allow it to expand, even if not to sort of invade the rights of free states. This is what we talked about in a past lecture as, we'll talk about in this lecture, but you've probably seen it in your textbook. It's called dough faces. These are Northern Democrats who are very much comfortable with and in bed with, to some degree, the slave power. And I mean that in sometimes in metaphorical, but also a literal sense, because some northern people had cousins, siblings, sons that move down south and become slave owners, right? They want to get in on the money, so they go buy up a bunch of, they get a loan from the bank, they buy up a bunch of slaves, buy up a bunch of land, and get in on the cotton business. And so even though they're northerners living in the south, all of their family relations are back in places like New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, and so on. Now, these northern Democrats, especially Martin Van Buren, are not going to let compromise be swept away. So Martin Van Buren leads the charge. They march out of the Democratic convention. They go to Buffalo, New York, and have their own convention, and this begins a new political party. Now, the Free Soil Party doesn't last more than 10 years. Martin Van Buren himself is not a real believer in a new party system. There are people who join the Free Soil Party who believe, right, no, if we want a party that represents us, we need to go our own way. But for people like Martin Van Buren, this is basically it's like applying shock therapy to the Democratic Party, right? You wanna play Democrats, right? You think you don't need us Northerners, right? Those of us who are not a part of the slaveocracy, right? Think again, right? We're gonna turn on you. So Martin Van Buren and his cohort of Democrats storm out. They have their own convention. They elect Martin Van Buren, right? Former president, a very kind of influential and name, he's got a name brand. They nominate him for president, and John Quincy Adams' son, Charles Adams, for vice president. So it's kind of an interesting confluence of interests, because Van Buren, on the one hand, a solid Jacksonian, a Democrat, somebody who believes in Northern interests, but he's willing to work with Southerners. And then you get Charles Adams, the son of John Quincy Adams, who was an opponent of Andrew Jackson, who became a staunch Whig and was a strict opponent of the slave power. Right? We kind of mentioned John Quincy Adams. He's just going to keep popping up because I would argue, obviously people have different ranks for American presidents or American politicians, but John Quincy Adams was probably the least remembered president in some ways, but he's probably one of the best presidents, or he had the best intent. He actually had a good vision for the United States, and it's a path not taken, at least not in this era, or not when he was president in the 1820s. Nevertheless, right, it shows this confluence of interest that Northerners are starting to realize that they're on their own. Southerners aren't going to play ball with them, at least not the power brokers in the Democratic Party. Now, this party, it doesn't really do well. It only gets about 10% of the vote, and it doesn't do anything to overcome the problems within the Democratic Party. But there is a sense where the Free Soil Party, because of its agitation and its drawing out otherwise stalwart Northern Democrats, it causes the Democratic Party to lose in 1848, right? And Democrats are replaced with the Whigs, who run Zachary Taylor, the Mexican American war hero, the general, the critic of James K. Polk. They decide to run with him. And the kind of funny thing about Zachary Taylor, he probably didn't even vote for himself because he was illiterate, and therefore he couldn't vote. So, hey, if you don't know how to read, you could still get pretty far. But anyway, the jokes aside, right? Buffalo Convention, it fails. Free Soil Party doesn't succeed. 10% of the votes, the best they'll ever do. After the election, many of them, Martin Van Buren included, go back into the Democratic Party, basically saying, you got to get you guys act together because you need us. But the Free Soil Party shows the possibility of introducing a new party, right? The Whigs seem to be crumbling, right? There are many Whigs in the North who are totally offended at the idea of Zachary Taylor as president. Now, Zachary Taylor is from Louisiana, and as you might expect, he was a plantation owner. He had lots of slaves, he was very wealthy, and he made sugar. Not as good as, not as money invested as cotton, but Louisiana sugar plantations were still, if cotton plantation masters were billionaires, then sugar was in the millionaire category, right? One step below, but still very wealthy, very powerful, very important, well connected with a lot of other families. And so who was a Northern Whig going to vote for? The slave party or a slave owner running for a party that doesn't know what it stands for? So the Whig Party's rapidly undoing itself. Free Soilers don't know what to do, right? The Democratic Party, where maybe got a little shakeup, maybe it'll start respecting them, but there's increasingly, especially by the existence of the Liberty Party, there's increasingly a larger segment of the American population that, or at least at a mainstream level, are now hostile to the expansion and even to some extent the existence of slavery. So, like I said, Taylor and Fillmore are elected, the first Whig ticket to win since William Henry Harrison, and that didn't even really amount to much in terms of actual Whig goals. Um, I won't get into too much about these presidents because they're pretty not a whole lot happens, at least in terms of American policies. Right, they're considered some of the most ineffective presidents. But just I'll rattle off a couple of things. Zachary Taylor dies, sometime into his office. Somewhere between a year and 2 years into his presidency. Some people think he was poisoned, but it was later scholars investigated this and they did an autopsy, and it was probably he had a gastrointestinal infection from eating raw cherries. Um, make of that what you will, but he's succeeded by his running mate Millard Fillmore. Fillmore doesn't do a whole lot, but he's kind of famous for he sends an American admiral to Japan to sort of blow open trade relations. There's a whole history with Japanese isolation from the rest of the world. Now, this event doesn't have a whole lot of significance for the United States, right? The U.S. goes in with its big iron boats, and Japan is still run by samurai. They still have swords and bows. They have wooden boats, and so they see these giant steam-powered ships with guys with automatic guns, right? The repeating rifles being invented during this period, and they're just blown away. So this isn't a big deal for American history, but in Japanese history, Commodore Perry's arrival is a game changer, right? Japan is never the same after this. It goes through an incredible amount of industrialization and kind of a revolutionary change in its own government. And you can't understand Japanese history without this visit, right? Commodore Perry showing up, and the Americans blowing down the door and say, "You're going to trade with us. You're gonna buy our stuff." That's a benchmark in Japanese history. But this isn't a class on Japanese history, so I'm going to leave it there. But that's mainly the thing Millard Fillmore is known for. At the same time, when Zachary Taylor and Fillmore come to the presidency, they are in the midst of deciding what to do with these new territories, right? We got more Texas coming in, right? Texas is going to be a slave state. It's a bunch of slaves there. But then what are we going to do with the territory that will become the states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado? So the idea is, what do we do with this, right? Because all of them are below the Mason-Dixon line. This doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? This is going to give a ton of power to the South, right? All of this territory could be slave territory. So there's a great fear among the North. Again, Northerners are pushing to say, we don't want any new territory unless we guarantee that all of it's free. So in comes the ancient at this point, is basically a mummy, Henry Clay. Henry Clay comes in and brokers one more deal, right? One more way to try to maintain the power, right? And that's his thing. The generation, right? John C. Calhoun is moving more towards Southern nationalism, right? The South needs to go its own way no matter what. But a lot of these guys from the age of Jackson, these kind of original Whigs, people like Daniel Webster, who is known as a Cotton Whig, Henry Clay, who's a solid Whig, right? And he's from Kentucky and he owns slaves. But there are also some Southern Whigs. They want to keep the balance of power, right? They're not against slavery. They might not like it as much as other people do, and they might not think it's something that makes America great, the way John C. Calhoun does. But they want to make the country stable, right? The only way to do this is by giving the North some power and give the South some power, and give the North some power and give the South some power. For them, this keeps this kind of equilibrium, right? But for critics of them, and this is what I would argue, is this is just sort of forestalling the question. Infinite compromise is basically a way of avoiding answering a question. But if the question needs an answer, then you're just sort of, delaying the inevitable. So anyway, Clay brokers this deal. In this, he goes through a complicated set of legislative acts. The North and South kind of balance some stuff out. On the one hand, you get the Fugitive Slave Act passed, which means now, right, previously the federal government would not involve itself in the affairs of states when it came to the issue of slavery. But the Fugitive Slave Act really intensifies and gets the federal government more involved, where states are now culpable, means they can be blamed, and they're doing something illegal if they do not return escaped slaves back to their masters. So lots of fugitive slaves, right? We saw Frederick Douglass. They would run north, so he goes to a place like Pennsylvania and then eventually Massachusetts. And if his master goes looking for him and says, "Hey, that's my slave," the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania governments, they have to return these slaves. If they don't, they're violating the law. So this seemed to be a big boost to the South, at least, whether this is actually enforced is another thing, but this seems to kind of be a moral victory for them. But on the other hand, to balance things, slavery is outlawed in Washington, D.C., right? And this is a victory for the North because this is the nation's capital. And if you got slavery in the nation's capital, that seems to make slavery seem more normal, right? Again, these are mostly symbolic victories. Fugitive Slave Act's not that big of a deal. Banning slavery from Washington, D.C. is not that big of a deal, right? There's not huge plantations in Washington, D.C. Most urban slaves kind of had semi-autonomy. They could kind of do side jobs. They basically would kind of have the time to themselves during most of the workday. They get rented out to help this or that person. But, this isn't a major victory in terms of politics, but both North and South are scared by these things, right? Again, this is a symbolic victory. It seems to be from the South's point of view, the North is coming after them. And from the North's point of view, it seems like the South is slowly creeping and absorbing everything, right? And so anyway, Henry Clay forestalls any immediate conflict, and in his mind, right, he forestalled the apocalypse, right? The North and South aren't going to tear each other apart, right? He saved the day once again. So here are some images of the presidents, right? So that's Zachary Taylor, right? It's all per, so that's Zachary Taylor. This guy there, that's Fillmore. I think he kind of looks like Alec Baldwin, but whatever, not important. The president after him we'll see a little bit more about is a guy named Franklin Pierce. He's a Democrat from New Hampshire, and he's a solid doughface. And then you get James Buchanan, the only president elected from the state of Pennsylvania, and routinely rated one of the worst presidents to ever, occupy the White House. We'll see some of the reasons why. But a lot of these guys are compromise candidates. They're chosen because they're trying to offend the least amount of people, and they're just representing the ticking time bomb that is 1850s federal politics. So the compromise is ongoing. We roll around to 1852. Franklin Pierce is elected, and this is the complete meltdown of the political order, right? As you see, Franklin Pierce, he dominates. He wins one of the most decisive electoral victories, even though nobody really cares much about him. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody really likes him. But it has to do with the main issues. Even though the election looks like a complete slam dunk, right? It wasn't a total blowout. Winfield Scott actually wins. He wins 40-something% of the vote, right? There are far less close electoral slam dunks in American history. But this looks across the board. Democrats run a total nobody and take almost the entire board in terms of electoral college votes. Winfield Scott, he's a very old general. He helped Martin Van Buren back when he was president in the 1830s. He was a participant in the War of 1812. He'll live even into the beginning of the Civil War, but he's very old. He's ancient. The Whigs run him because he's another compromise candidate. He says, right, I'm not going to decide on the issue of slavery. I'm not going to decide on anything. But Winfield Scott personally had some anti-slave opinions, so he's not popular in the North because he seems to be willing to work with the slaveocracy. He's not popular in the South because his personal opinions about slavery are coming out. So basically everybody turns against him, and the Democratic Party at this point has become the slave party. Southern Whigs are realizing they can't work with their Northern Whig peers. They're willing to risk the continuity and the success and wealth of slavery to continue this balancing act, and are constantly, being attacked by even more the conscience Whigs, even more anti-slave Whigs who are within the party. So 1852, the Whig Party is dead. So let's get to the new political realities besetting the country on a variety of different issues, right? So one major faction we got to take account of, which is basically equivalent with the Democratic Party at this point, is the slave power, right? What do they want? So one way of dealing with slavery in the country is the new agenda adopted by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, right? Stephen Douglas will actually win his Senate seat or keep his Senate seat from a contender by the name of Abraham Lincoln, who runs right as a Republican, but will ultimately lose. And we'll get to who are the Republicans in a minute. But where did that political party come from? But right, Stephen A. Douglas introduces a new concept, which will become really important for its failure, and that's the idea of popular sovereignty. So how should we solve the slave question? Stephen Douglas, right? You hedge it. You say, okay, any territory that wants to join the United States says, okay, we want to be a state. We're going to assemble our constitution. But the first question we got to vote on is, do we want to be a slave state or do we want to be a free state? To people in Douglas's camp, which there are not many, but to Douglas's supporters, this seems to be the most effective compromise. On the one hand, it's very democratic, right? This is an idea of Jacksonianism. Let the people decide what they want. Do they want to have slaves? Do they not want to have slaves, right? They're not, of course, they're not obviously asking the slaves who, probably do not want to be held in bondage if they had the choice. Nevertheless, right, all white men are able to vote and get to decide which way the state wants to go, right? So it seems to be in line with the philosophy of Jackson. Second of all, right, it seems to be a good compromise, right? It's basically throwing out the Henry Clay strategy of one state for one state. So get a slave state, get a free state, get a slave state, get a free state, and keep trying to balance things. But the problem with this, right, is that this was the whole idea of a balancing act is what got both sides invested. The North would get free states, the South would get slave states, and they would both be happy for any further acquisition of territory. But with Douglas's strategy, it's really a coin toss. You don't know, right? What if the people moving to a new territory are from New England? Then they're going to vote for free state. What if they're coming from Georgia? What if they're coming from Alabama, right? Then they're probably going to vote for slave state. So what happens if they both end up in the same place? That's where you get real messy, and we'll get to some of this stuff in a moment. But this new idea is now on the table. Another thing slowly creeping up, which is still rather unpopular for a number of Southern elites, is the idea of just straight out separatism, right? Secession. So John C. Calhoun, right? Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, they all die around 1852, 1853, that era, that little period of time, right? Right as all this stuff is starting to unravel, they all die. But in John C. Calhoun's sort of last opinions, he's basically coming to the point that the South might very well need to go its own way. It needs to prepare to, at least, right? It's better to protect slavery, which is what makes America great, continue on the values and the virtues of the American Revolution, continuing on in the legacy of Washington, Jefferson, and so on. Right? That's how he interprets this. So if you need to separate again, just like the colony separated from Great Britain, then you got to go for it, because this is too key, too essential. This is the defense of property. This is the defense of the peculiar institution that makes the South a great civilization. So you just gotta prepare to go your own way. And actually, you won't get this in any textbook, but this is actually one of the wildest things. This is with this little symbol here. So there are actually people in the South that come up with a secret society, if you can believe it. It's called the Order of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Right? This sounds very mysterious and kind of spooky. Basically, what these people were planning, right? Again, it's a secret society, so nobody knows who these members are. But when the member lists eventually get revealed later on in time, some pretty high people, eventually a vice president of the United States is part of this. And this group basically imagines creating an American empire built on slavery around what they call the Golden Circle. And if you want to pull up a map, if you see there's a circle forming around the Gulf of Mexico, right? It's all the southern states, it's Caribbean islands like Cuba, and it goes all the way down into Colombia and through Central America, right? Their idea is basically, if we detach from the rest of the Union, we should either solicit peacefully or conquer Central America, Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, and will become one large slave empire because this area, on this pretty fertile part of the equator, with very good land that could be, turned places like Nicaragua, turn it into a cotton field, turn Mexico into a cotton field, turn Cuba's got sugar, Louisiana's got sugar, Georgia's got cotton, right? You can turn it into this great agricultural empire. And so this sounds totally nuts. But yeah, there was a secret society about breaking off from the Union and creating a Southern empire. And they have it's pretty wild. They have these connections with large plantation owners in parts of Latin America. We won't really get into this, but it's a kind of weird trivia fact. Brazil still has slavery. It's legal to own slaves in Brazil until the 1880s. And after the Confederacy loses the Civil War, a bunch of ex-Confederates, they actually escape and they move down to Brazil and they start their own town. And the descendants of these Confederate soldiers, they still will dress up. No, there's no slavery in Brazil anymore, and they don't really, they're not thinking about slavery. Some of the people look kind of Indian or are black, but they're the descendants of these Confederates who moved down to Brazil, and they still have this like Confederate Day when they honor their ancestors. Again, this is in Brazil. So it's kind of wild. But anyway, this conspiracy was also part of this idea that maybe the South needs to start thinking in totally separate terms to the North. Two different countries, right? That's the future. And then finally, right, there are interests of Northern finance, Northern merchants, and maybe a few Northern industrialists, and they're willing to give the South whatever it takes, right? They don't personally own slaves, though, as I said, they might be married to, into slave-owning families, or they have nephews, cousins, children who then move south and take up a plantation to make some money and then move back north. And they're called dough faces. And these are basically Northerners, right? They're from New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, but their interests are Southern at heart. So they will do whatever it takes to keep the United States together, and they will do whatever it takes to defend the interests of the slave power. Now, another major element to the new politics of the 1850s is a group called the Know-Nothings. Now, there's a lot of angst I talked about throughout the country in its urban centers involved with the future of labor relations between employer and employee and how that relationship is being shaken up by newcomers, right? So if you have the quote unquote Native Americans who live in these places, people whose families go back hundreds of years, and then you get the new arrivals. So you have some free blacks moving to places like New York and Philadelphia, though there are very few of them. And then you have this massive influx of immigrants, and that's what this political cartoon is making fun of. Right? You got the Irish with their Irish whiskey, and you got the Germans, their lager, right, and their beer. And the idea was that these guys are moving in, they're taking jobs, right? The Germans don't speak English necessarily, they don't speak it very well. The Irish are very distinct, right? They're Roman Catholics when most of the United States is some version of Protestant. They sound funny. They have this kind of accent about them. They don't have a normal American accent. And they have this reputation that's derived from centuries of sort of English-Irish antipathy. Sort of they hate each other. The English thought the Irish were a bunch of monkeys. They thought they were apes. They looked kind of human, but they weren't human. And all they did all day, they would fight. They would get drunk. They were always drinking whiskey, right? And therefore they're always drunk. They blow all their money, so they're not productive members of society. They're just alcoholics. And they just fornicate with abandon, and they have ridiculously oversized families, right? So if you've ever heard the term Irish twins, that was sort of a derogatory term about how the Irish, they don't know how to use birth control. They just go home, beat up their wife, knock her up. 9 months later, they do the same thing, and they just pump out kids, right? They're crazy, out of control, they have all sorts of problems, and so on and so forth, right? So it's all this kind of bigoted anti-immigrant attitudes, but it's rooted in economic problems, right? They don't just hate the Irish because they hate the Irish for no reason, though of course they're inheriting some of these stereotypes. They don't like the Irish because the Irish come in and they're taking their jobs, right? So you could say maybe their critiques are valid, but their criticisms are going to the wrong place, right? Maybe it's the employer's fault for exploiting this new work situation where they can pay the Irish less than these Native American people, right? Who are either not getting the jobs or they're being paid less because they have to compete with these new immigrants, right? Sometimes, right, when there's more people who can work the same job, then the employer can then choose, oh, I'm going to drive the price down, but of course you still need a job, so I can pay you whatever I want because I know if you don't want to do it, I'll find someone who will. There's 10 guys lined up behind you who are itching to get this job. So this is very frustrating to them. On top of it, in southern cities, and this is a story you don't usually hear, and it's kind of bizarre if you think about it. In southern cities, slave owners, who either have too many slaves or they're not cotton owners, right? Especially in states like Maryland that are not good for growing cotton. Virginia is not very good for growing cotton. So they grow tobacco, but tobacco is not super lucrative. So one way of kind of making up your loss, you own these slaves, so you should do something with them, is you send them into the city and you have them work on the dock, right? People basically rent your slave for the day, but then the slave could basically do side jobs and make some money for himself, right? So in northern South states like Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, slaves could have their own money. It wasn't usually as brutal as the cotton plantation, but right, it depends. Right, you're totally in the hands of your master. In the case of Frederick Douglass, he had horrible masters. Sometimes he had kind of incompetent ones that left him alone, right? Some masters were probably kind of nice to their slaves and treated them like their kids or their family, right? But it's why would you ever want to put your life into the hands of someone else and that you have no power over and probably think you are basically a child or some kind of lower animal, that you're not actually a human being, right? And that means they could do all sorts of horrible things to you, rape, working you to death, or just like lesser things like just treating you like you're an idiot. So you get a whole variety of different things. But anyway, you're going to the city. A lot of these slaves, they're kind of autonomous, as I said. They can earn some money for themselves. But by being able to do that work, they're taking jobs from free, poor white guys who live in the city. And of course, right, as say you're running a shop, you're working on the dock, what would you rather have, the poor white guy or the enslaved person, right? You pick the slave person because, first of all, you might not even have to pay him because he works for his master. But if you do pay him, he's probably grateful to just have something, right? The idea that there's some expectation that you have to pay him a minimum wage or something is out the window, right? So you get this funny situation. Some of these people who are called know-nothings, they're going to form a political party called the American Party. They're against slavery. They are against these slaves coming into the city and taking their jobs. Why? Because they're taking jobs from good, hardworking white men. White men deserve the jobs, not the black men, right? This isn't fair. We're free citizens. These are slaves. What are you doing? So you actually get this funny anti-slavery resentment among poor whites throughout the South, particularly in urban areas like Baltimore or Richmond. And so the American Party will actually be rather powerful within the urban areas of the South, Atlanta, New Orleans, and etc. Of course, right, most of the country is still not urban, right? It's urbanizing rapidly in the north, but urban areas are not very important to the South, right? Overwhelmingly, most people live in the countryside. So they're influential, but they're not that influential. So there's concern about immigrants changing the values, taking away their jobs, right? But then also introducing strange things like Catholicism, right? They're afraid that these immigrants are basically working for the Pope. But then there's also kind of more nuts and bolts electoral corruption. And that's what this political cartoon's making fun of, right? You get all these Irish guys off the boat and you say, look, man, I'll give you a nickel. I'll give you a place where you can live, but you need to vote Democrat. And that's usually, Whigs tended to be more hostile and kind of more interested in creating a national culture, a national set of values, right? People who are involved in the public school movement, the idea of trying to educate everyone in these basic American values as citizens, they tend to be Whigs. Democrats are less concerned, right? They're concerned. They don't really like this project because for many of them, it's violating the spirit of Jefferson, the idea of small government. And, you don't want to, there's also some hostility, right? We don't want to impose a specific creed, a specific set of religious values. So people who are less religious, more secular, or even atheistic tend to gravitate to the Democratic Party. You also get some very religious people who are not interested in joining this large evangelical movement, who also will vote Democrat for the same reasons, right? They don't want the country kind of swept over with this crusader mentality. They're not firm believers in, you know, in the idea that you can reform all of society if you just work hard enough and you believe in it. That tended to be things associated with the Whigs, but not exclusively. And this kind of suspicion, skepticism, or hostility tended to be associated with Democrats. And so the Irish as Catholics and these Germans who are Catholics, they sign on with that, right? You're not going to harass us. You're going to mostly leave us alone, and we'll vote for you, right? Whatever. And so for Whigs, not only is this chipping away at American virtue and American values, but it's also chipping away at the entire election system itself, right? This is voter corruption. You're basically paying people off. Sometimes literally, you would literally just buy votes. And at this time when you voted, there was no secret ballot. So when you voted, everyone knew who you voted for. And there was also a cultural mood where when you show up to vote, you got to wear your colors. So it would be like today, right? You got to wear your Make America Great Again hat if you want to go vote. If you're a real man, right? You got to show you're going to vote for Trump, or you got to go vote, show your Joe Biden, I'm with Biden shirt, right? While you go vote, you got to tell everyone who you're voting for, right? Otherwise, you're a coward. Of course, this is ripe for voter intimidation, right? If there's 99 Trump guys who are standing around the ballot box and you're the Biden guy and you show up, or you're not a Trump guy, right? You might be scared, you might not want to, or you might actually vote the other way. And right, vice versa. If there's 99 Biden guys and you're a Trump guy, right? You might get beat, the crap kicked out of you. This is what happened. You literally be intimidated. They would beat you up. And then if you see someone else get beat up, then you're gonna really take your chances. So for places with very strong political machines like New York City with the Democrats, it was very hard to kind of break that monopoly, and so it bred a lot of corruption. And so what happened, right? What are these know nothings? Well, a lot of these people who are fed up with this system, they're fed up with the Whigs not doing enough. They decide to start their own political party. But right, the fear is that look, if people find out we're doing this, they're going to shut us down. So they start basically, the political party starts as a secret society, which is kind of funny. They're doing the secret society, right? A lot of Americans are fearful of secret societies because what happens behind closed door? What do they really talk about? What are they really doing? But they did this basically for the same reason, right? The political system was too corrupt, and that, I'll get voter intimidation. Like a bunch of guys who are in the Democratic Party might beat you up if you go and try to vote against them in a mayor election in New York City, or for whatever ward you're in, or whatever it might be at this very local level. So they formed this secret society, and if someone's supposed to ask you, right, you're supposed to say, "I know nothing," right? So that's where the phrase "know nothings" come from, right? That's sort of what you're supposed to do to kind of communicate to each other, but then also to outsiders, that to kind of keep suspicion away from you. But then for insiders, when they hear you say "I know nothing," they know you're a know nothing. They know you're in the American Party, and they will eventually break out into the political scene. And they actually do pretty well for themselves. They will nominate Millard Fillmore for president in 1856, and he actually wins the state of Maryland. But that's another thing on the horizon, and it's this kind of funny thing, and I'm not going to unpack all the ramifications, but there was this funny thing in that white supremacy was used to fight slavery. It's like you'd think it would be counterintuitive, right? You'd think if you're a white supremacist, you would automatically support slavery. But for the people who don't own slaves and who are feeling the brunt of economic realities of urban life, competing with people who don't have to be paid anything, really, if the master kind of worked out that agreement, then you don't like that system. It screws you up. It makes your life more difficult. So there's a contingent of people in the South who are opposed to slavery. It's not the majority. Most Southerners are still committed to the idea of slavery, even though they don't. Right? Again, only 25% own slaves. But this is a new element added into politics, both North and South. So like I said, 1852 rolls around, the Whig Party collapses, right? Pierce just wipes the floor with Scott. Whigs have no common ground. Their only common unity is that they're not Democrats. But Southern Whigs tend to represent the most wealthiest and powerful plantation owners in the South. Some Northern Whigs are linked into the slave economy, and other Northern Whigs, what are called sometimes conscience Whigs, are opposed to slavery. So how can you have a political party that has no values in common? Most of its political structure is basically trying to keep up and copy the Democrats, right? The Democratic Party is the first real modern political party, and you can think, right, both its pluses and downsides. And you can thank Martin Van Buren basically for that by creating this national coalition of state parties that all kind of operate as a single unit, right? This kind of organization. It also involves some kind of corruption, right? This graft patronage system. If I work for you, I'll get you a job. Um, or if I work for you, you will get me a job and I'll be loyal to you, and so on, and you build your networks this way. So it breeds all kinds of corruption. Um, but the Democrats are the first ones to do this. Whigs try to keep up. They're not very good at it. They have some success here and there, but then it eventually implodes, right? None of these Whigs are on the same thing. They stop even meeting together in conventions because Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs start having radically different ideas about the future of the country. So they're done. So by end of 1852, there's only one political party left. But right, what's going to happen, right? We got free soil, right? Free soil against slavery and against this growing money interest, right? They're trying to inhabit the true reality of Jacksonian democracy. So they're right, in any kind of political movement. This is a useful lesson just in life, right? Any thinker, any philosophy, anything that happens, it can produce multiple results, right? So in this case, right, Jackson produces, right, even Jefferson, if you want to go forward, it produces multiple variations, right? So we saw how Jefferson could produce a national Republican like John Quincy Adams, but he could also produce, right, the small government types who are, like Martin Van Buren, who just want the federal government to not be involved in too many things to restrain corruption. And then there are also interpretations of Jefferson that are growing in the South to see him as the defender of the plantation gentleman and the Southern way of life against Northern industry. And so they'll quote things from Jefferson about how manufacturing sucks, it's horrible, cities are evil, and the future therefore is in plantations, and the success of the country's wealth depends upon slavery to develop those plantations. So you can develop a figure in multiple different ways, right? Jefferson himself as a person doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's his legacy, and what are you going to do with that legacy? So same thing with Jackson. There's a legacy of Jackson which helps develop the slave power in the South, right? Jackson was a slave owner. But of course, there's other elements of Jackson that are more complicated, right? Jackson was not a small government Democrat. He expanded the power of the presidency. Jackson went to war with South Carolina over nullification and asserted the federal government's primacy in reining in a kind of renegade state, putting the national interest in harm's way for selfish reasons, right? Putting the United States in jeopardy because South Carolina was going to be a little bit more poor because it had to pay more on its tariffs, right? So one legacy of Jackson, right, is free soil. If Jacksonian democracy, if the American way, if fulfilling the goal and vision of the American Revolution, if that's going to succeed, it has to be without slavery. The United States cannot continue to be a slave power. Now again, free soil could involve high levels of racism. In fact, most free soilers were racist. They did believe in the supremacy of the white race. They did believe in the existence of races and that the whites are superior. They didn't necessarily see a future for black Americans, or at least maybe they could live in segregated communities far away from everyone else. But they were anti-slavery, right? So the free soil movement's trying to carry out this legacy of Jackson and pursue it to rein in and squeeze out the slave power, right? And so together with many of these Northern Whigs of a variety of shapes and sizes, they form a brand new political party, right? Brand new, right? So this Republican Party does not have ties to Jefferson's Republican Party. In fact, you could probably say the Democratic Party of Jackson and Van Buren was literally an organizational outgrowth of Jeffersonian Republicans, right? Right. As we saw in the election of 1824 and in 1828, the Republican Party was diverse, right? It ran four different candidates, like all against each other, all with slightly different interests, right? You had small government types that were represented by Crawford. You had John Quincy Adams and the National Republicans. You had Henry Clay's variation on that, and then you had Andrew Jackson, who was kind of more of a mystery figure at that point. But you had all these different ideas, and so one of them succeeds, Andrew Jackson kind of fusing with Martin Van Buren, and that becomes the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party is brand new, made up of pieces of people leaving the Democratic Party under the banner of free soil and free labor. So you get these urban radicals too. And then also these northern Whigs, some of whom were conscience Whigs. So these are Whigs who are committed to ending the slave power in the South. Again, not all of them are, not most of them are not abolitionists, meaning they actually want to get rid of slavery by a federal statute or a constitutional amendment. But they do want to stop the expansion of slavery. And then you also get old school Whigs who are probably who used to be more comfortable with the slave power, but the changing dimensions of economic reality in the North make its partnership with slavery less and less appealing. And there's a whole history about the rising and shrinking value of cotton. But as we'll see in another lecture, the North starts to change economically towards exporting wheat, and its industrialization starts to expand beyond the issues of simply textiles and cotton production, right? So that was Massachusetts. Massachusetts has its big textile factories, but you see in places like Pennsylvania the development of iron and steel industries. And that's linked to the development of railroads, but also any kind of transportation, or steamboats, production of roads, production of basically anything made out of iron and steel, anything metal, right? There's a ton of stuff made out of metal. Those industrial efforts have nothing to do with slavery, and so they become linked into sort of competition over the future of their own ability to grow, right? If the economy is being shaped to benefit the cotton growers, it's not going to be shaped to benefit the steelworks. Why? Because cotton growers relied on lower tariffs, right? They want to ship out their raw goods and purchase finished goods from abroad. But for manufacturers, they want what's called protection, right? Or the system is called protectionism, and that's where the government has high tariffs so that they could protect their own industries. And the reason why you'd want to do that is because, right, if you depend on another country for their stuff, if they want to go to war with you, you're really crippled. So the country in its key industries, it wants to protect these things. And so, that's a whole economic, political debate over the merits of protectionism / nationalism versus free trade. Most people don't talk about it anymore, but it's a really important topic if you don't understand the political values of economy, right? It's not really, it's a lot more complicated than the way it usually is portrayed in the news, but that's a whole other story. It's a much more important story to understand the next component of American history. So if you're going to take U.S. history too in the future, you should really find out what protectionism is and try to understand that as a political strategy and how that sees the United States turn into a premier power over the 19th and 20th century. But leave that off there. The Republican Party kind of comes together of all these diverse interests. It's about the right of the average worker, the idea of the average farm owner. It's all about bringing this stuff together to basically create a party opposed to the future of the slaveocracy in the South, right? Whether it's industry, whether it's the small farmer, whether it's the urban worker, none of them are linked to slavery. And so the North increasingly becomes congealed around an anti-slave political idea. So here's where we get to the real bloody and gutsy part of the 1850s, right? So it's not, the reason things blow up is not just, oh, there's new political parties, there's new ideas, there's new stuff, right? No, it's because there's literally blood spilled, right? And this comes down to the failure of popular sovereignty. So okay, it's 1850s. Stephen Douglas, he's a celebrity in the Senate, right? He's well beloved. He's very charismatic. He's He's able to kind of motivate coalitions behind him. Seems to be the future for at least Northern Democrats. Now, Douglas wants to advance the cause of popular sovereignty, and he wants a test case to run in the new states of Nebraska and Kansas. They want to come into the Union, and Douglas wants them to practice this new idea, right? No more Missouri Compromise, no more Mason-Dixon line deciding slavery, North and South, right? Nope, it comes down to the people. They're fulfilling their Jacksonian vision, wanting to be citizens of the United States. They're going to vote. Now, the problem is Kansas. Nebraska is not such a big deal. Kansas is the big deal. Why? If you know geography of the United States, you'll know that Kansas is smack dab in the middle of the country. It's just a rectangle, right? It's mostly flat there. But Kansas is right next to Missouri. Right? Kansas City is in Missouri, right? These two are right next to each other. Now, if you remember the Missouri Compromise, it involves Missouri coming in as a slave state. Now, a lot of people living in Kansas are actually from the North. They're farmers from New York and from New England who are moving down for new opportunities to sort of get their own land. So they moved to Kansas. That's where they've been living for quite a while. However, at this sort of issue of popular sovereignty, right, the votes being made, is Kansas going to be a free state or a slave state? A lot of slave owners in Missouri, right, it's literally right next door, they're motivated to kind of just jump over the border and cast the vote. Of course, this is voter fraud. They don't actually live in Kansas. But this is an age where, long before the idea of driver's license, voter registration, where you have an ID, a picture ID, you can prove where you live, right? None of that matters, right? So all they have to do is go over the border, vote, and then go home. So that's what happens. Kansas turns into a bloody mess because the vote happens. Most Kansans are actually in favor of free state, but the vote comes back and it says slave. Kansas is going to be a slave state. And everybody knows this is fake, right? Stephen Douglas knows this was all screwed up, right? He even knows that it's voter fraud. It's all these people from Missouri stepping over the border with all their brothers and cousins and whatever and voting to make Kansas a slave state. And it's not just because they're selfish and they want access to land. They're also fearful because if Missouri's right next to a free state, what's to stop their slaves from running away to Kansas and then hiding, right? Yes, there's a Fugitive Slave Act, but it's not super effective, right? You actually have to have police to go out and do this stuff. And there are bounty hunters you can hire to kind of go look for slaves, but it's expensive. And a lot of these farmers in Missouri are not the giant cotton kings that you find in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, right? No. They're relatively, the territory of Missouri is pretty much like Kansas. It's not great for cotton. So if you own slaves in Missouri, you're not probably super rich. You might be, in the top 10%, maybe top 20%, but you're not a 1%er, right? You're not in charge of anything. So you probably can't afford to just lose slave after slave after slave, and you can't hire people to go look for them. So they're really scared about what this will do, right? Again, we're just trying to understand the mentality, not justify it, but we understand why they're so freaked out. Why would they commit to this kind of wholesale voter fraud, where the total scale of the United States is being reduced to people just hopping over a border in a kind of arbitrarily decided fashion, right? Anyway, this happens, but as you might expect, people cry foul, right? This is unfair. The North leads the charge, denouncing what this horrible thing that's taking place. The South says, nope, the vote's totally legit. They said slave state, it's going to be a slave state. Bam, problem solved. But what really matters is that Kansas turns into a bloodbath. The people of Kansas, by and large, reject this vote. Most of them are free soilers. They do not want to participate in this. The Missouri says that's the law. It turns into a kind of microcosm of what will be the Civil War. Brother turns on brother. Neighbor turns against neighbor. Guerrilla units, as in like little militias that hide out and they don't dress up like soldiers. They start forming where groups of 8 to 10 people go around. They'll shoot at each other, and then if I kill my neighbor, I kill you, right? And then your brother says, hey, you kill my brother, they're going to come after you, or they're going to come after me. And so then somebody shoots me, but then somebody says, "Hey, you killed my brother," and so it becomes this back and forth war in Kansas, where it's what's known as in the history books as Bleeding Kansas, and it gets referred to this in several congressional speeches. Kansas is bleeding, and who's to blame but the South and its slaveocracy that promotes voter fraud and then ratifies it, right? Even Stephen A. Douglas, even the king of popular sovereignty, right? The guy who coined the idea, he knows it's a fraud. He's opposed to it, right? So you can quickly see this whole scheme unraveling. Now, a Massachusetts senator by the name of Charles Sumner stands up in Congress one day. He denounces the evil of the South, right? He denounces the affliction of Kansas and the bloodbath that's unfolding, right? And he goes through names. He names names. He gives a list. He accuses the South of basically raping Kansas. If you imagine Kansas as this poor virgin girl and the South is this evil, lecherous pervert, he rapes her, right? That's what the South is doing to Kansas. They're raping her. Of course, if you're a Southerner, this is highly inflammatory. And he's naming names, like I said, right? He's calling out congressional people. He's calling out senators. He's calling out congressmen. He's calling out Southern governors. He's calling out wealthy elites who are running affairs in the Southern states. He's ruthless. But he pisses off a guy named Preston Brooks. Now, Preston Brooks, he was a cousin to somebody that Sumner calls out. And so a couple of days later, Sumner's sitting at his desk in Congress. He's working on something. And Preston Brooks comes up right behind him with a cane, and he beats the shit out of him. He hits him so hard, right, and he just keeps hitting him and hitting him and hitting him. He beats him so hard that Sumner goes blind for several days. Sumner tries to stand up. The desk is bolted to the ground, but he stands up so violently he rips the desk out of the ground, trying to escape the blows from this cane, right? And Preston Brooks eventually stops beating him because the golden orb on top of his staff breaks. It smashes off on Sumner's head. So, okay, if you think politics is bad now, right? Republicans, Democrats yelling at each other, right? We're nowhere close to people literally being beat the shit out. They get the shit beat out of them, right? It's not even close, right? Sumner almost dies from this, right? He's almost in a coma. Now, okay, so what are the reactions? Of course, the North, right, like this political cartoon shows, right, this just reveals the true essence of the South. You try to have a debate, right, you speak your mind, and what do? They beat you with a stick. So shut the hell up. How are you going to do it? Not with words, but with violence. So this is basically the end of democracy, where you just kill your enemies, right? There's no voting. It's just assassinate your enemies. From the South's point of view, right, rather than condemning it or kind of shying away from it, many Southerners cheer on Preston Brooks. They send him canes in the mail, right? They send him a new cane, right? Broke his cane, so they send him a new one, right? One of the stabs he gets says, it's engraved in it. It says, "Hit him again." So encouraging Preston Brooks to continue his violence against Northern congressmen, anti-slave congressmen. This only polarizes issues more, right? North, denouncing the violence of a Southern congressman, and the South celebrating it. So this only amplifies issues throughout the country. Now, as you see here, right, 1856 passes by, bleeding Kansas. It's still ongoing. It's still a bloody mess. The Republicans run their first candidate. They lose. Now, the key thing here is, though, they actually get on the map. All right, if you remember, the Free Soil Party, they got 10% of the vote. They didn't win any electoral college votes. I didn't show you the 1848 map, but it's not that important because they don't, it doesn't show you anything. But the Republicans are on the map. And another key thing is, if you actually add up the numbers, I'm not saying you have to, but Southerners are starting to realize the North is getting so many immigrants, right? They're having the most kids, right? The South is expanding, but at a much slower rate because of the lack of industrialization. Most immigrants who are coming to the United States are coming to the North. Cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, right? That's where all these Irish immigrants are. But yeah, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they become these massive states. You just look at their electoral numbers, right? They're double some of these southern states. They're realizing that the North could basically carry an election by itself. It doesn't need a single southern state, and that's what ultimately is going to happen. Um, but right, the Democratic Party runs a guy named James Buchanan. They picked Buchanan because Buchanan was the ambassador to Great Britain, so he was literally not in the country when all this horrible stuff is going down. Right, Franklin Pierce is a disaster. Nobody likes him. He's basically incompetent, which was probably compounded by the fact that he was an alcoholic and constantly drunk. He would go into these moods and he'd be depressed because he lost some family members and it caused him to be really down. But you can't really function, and so he's useless. The country's falling apart. Nothing he does seems to matter. He was elected on a compromise candidacy ticket, basically please the South at the expense of the North, right? Whatever it takes, right? So he's coming from New Hampshire. He's not a Southerner, but he's part of this Democratic dough-face wing that says, look, the South's interests are our interests as a party. Fremont, he's actually a pretty interesting guy. I won't get into him though, but he's from California. Fremont represents probably some of the more radical Republicans who are much more clearly against slavery. Now, again, the Republican Party as a free soil party is not about the federal government removing slavery from the South. But what it is about is by preventing any future state, right? You see all that gray territory, all of that the United States owns, and they might become a state at some point, right? The Republican Party says no more slave states, and we'll get into why that's important in a little bit. But Fremont represents that wing. There are some Republicans who are a lot more moderate, saying, oh, well, we're not going to let slavery expand, but, maybe we can kind of cut around the corners a little bit. We're not going to really talk about it that much. We're not going to pursue that as a legislative agenda. We're not going to try to incorporate these states. We're not going to really draw the rest of the country into a battle. So that's kind of, if you were to, if you say conservative or more radical, Fremont represents the more radical wing, and he turns off other, Northerners and Southerners especially, but people who are afraid of provoking a direct confrontation with the South. And then, of course, you get to see Millard Fillmore with the American Party. Remember, Know Nothings. For some reason, he wins the state of Maryland. Now, the probable reason is just the composition of Maryland, right? Maryland grows tobacco, no cotton. Slavery is not super profitable, so slaves are going to these urban areas. Maryland has some of the most developed urban parts, right? Baltimore, it's a huge port. And so the conflict between poor whites and wealthy slave-owning whites is much more intense in a state like that, and that's probably the gap through which Millard Fillmore and the American Party slid into, checking the Democrats. But nevertheless, James Buchanan wins the presidency, but James Buchanan is kind of like a ghost of Jackson. He thinks he's a tough guy, he thinks he's a commander, he tries to boss people around, but everyone thinks he's kind of a weirdo and a loser. He has got this he's got this kind of weird physical tic where he couldn't hear very well in one ear, so he'd always lean his head at a kind of he always had this kind of crooked look on his face because his head was always kind of tilted when you were talking to him, and it was sort of off-putting for a lot of people, and it didn't breed a lot of personal respect. But Buchanan represents the dough face. Because he's from Pennsylvania, he helps push Pennsylvania back into the Democratic Party, at least for this election, and it kind of keeps things frozen. But the conflict is heating up. Now, another major spark creating North versus South sentiment has to do with a Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott versus Sandford. Now, Dred Scott was a slave. He travels with his master on train. He goes to a northern city. And because he's in this northern city, he decides, right, I'm on free ground, I'm in a free land, so that makes me, by default, a free man. So he sues his master saying, look, I went through a free state, I'm free now. Of course, his master doesn't want that to be the case. They go to court, it goes all the way up to the tippy top, and, right, as you might expect, the Supreme Court decides in favor of Sandford against Dred Scott, 6-3. And they say, no, Dred Scott, you're still a slave, right? Sorry, you've got to go back to your master. Maybe not sorry, because, maybe they don't really care. But the real kicker for this case comes from the opinion. Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a Jackson-era appointment, so he's a firm Jacksonian, he writes his opinion, right? Not only does Dred Scott prove that prove that slaves going to free territories are not free men, but rather black free men have no rights whatsoever, right? American citizenship is defined by being white. You can only be a citizen if you're white. So this is beyond the scope of the case, but the Taney opinion is the Supreme Court's decision, and the Supreme Court's decision is the interpretation of the law. Therefore, right, what Taney's basically saying is that slavery is not coming to an end anytime soon. And, right, not only is citizenship restricted to anyone who's not white, but also it's unconstitutional to make any new to restrict the rights of slavery expanding to any new territory, right? So this seems to be throwing the gates open to a total domination of the South across the country, right? This is what Republicans feared. They knew the Democrats, they knew the Jacksonians still running the South, right? They knew they were going to turn against them, and now they're challenging, right? The issue of is the territories going to be free or slave is now the political issue of the day. Republicans are running to say, nope, the territories must be free. But now the Supreme Court is basically saying, you can't do that. It's illegal to restrict the territories, right? Basically throwing out Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance, the idea, where the federal government's acquiring these new territories, that they have to be free zones. Right? It's basically trying to roll this back. And it opens up the possibility that all the new territory that the United States gets is going to be slave territory, which is going to radically transform the federal government. All these senators, all these congressmen, they're all going to vote for the slaveocracy, right? They're all going to vote to defend the rights of slavery. And so this seems to be a horrible disaster. Now, at the same time all this is ongoing, you have the career and the sort of rise and fall of a man named John Brown. Now, John Brown is an abolitionist. He's very firm. He's very much like David Walker, if you remember him, that slavery is not just a bad thing. It is an unmitigated evil. It's a sin, and God's wrath is going to destroy all the slave owners, right? But unlike someone like William Lloyd Garrison, right, Brown is not interested in sort of party politics, right? He's not joining a political party to think he can kind of vote this way or that way, right? He's a man of action, right? Not that he's against the politics of it, but he's going to take up his own case, his own crusade against slavery, with or without Congress, with or without the states, right? He's going to wage a war against it. But unlike William Lloyd Garrison, who was a peacenik, right? He believed that this has to be solved rhetorically, right? You have to convince people that slavery is wrong, and so therefore you run your newspaper to write these editorials, to publish these stories, and win the moral argument, right? If you win the moral argument, if everyone knows that slavery is indefensible, you win. They're gonna abolish it. John Brown says no. John Brown's not averse to violence. In fact, if you own slaves, your time's coming, right? Right? It's like that. There's a Johnny Cash song, right? Sooner or later, God's gonna cut you down, and that's how John Brown thought about himself, right? He's gonna be the hand of God. He'll be the wrath that's going to be unleashed on these sinners. And he's going to make the issue come to the fore. Right? The nation will decide one way or the other, good or evil. It has to choose. No more compromise. So John Brown, he sees this all through this lens of being a very devout Christian, and he goes on his crusade. Him and his sons, they actually moved to Kansas, and for the very express point of taking up this war against the slave power. Right? He wants to see Kansas come in as a free state. And, he'll be damned if he sees Kansas dragged into the power of the slaveocracy. So he participates with his sons. He gets his gun. He will go house to house. He'll break into the house. He'll blow away slave owners. He won't kill the women or children, but he'll shoot. He'll get in all sorts of shootouts trying to kill Missouri pro-slave militias. He'll massacre people. Right? He's not afraid of bloodshed. Right? This is basically a form of terrorism, right? But, you might say it's terrorism for a good cause. But, that's where these words become flexible. For John Brown, for the people who support him, he's a freedom fighter. For the South, for the people who are opposed to him, he's a terrorist. He's a murderer. He's a killer. And that's what he does, right? He's not afraid of putting people down. And so John Brown is very much willing to do this. Now, he does this in Kansas for a few years. He'll eventually move back east. And he's going to put a group together. And he's going to sort of bring the issue to the fore. Now, in 1858, right, the people are not totally sure whether John Brown was maybe a little crazy. He maybe really thought God would intervene. in the sense of like sending down an army of angels or calling down the apocalypse. Um, or if John Brown was basically being political. He wanted to do this not because he thought he would win, but because it would make the rest of the nation decide. Nevertheless, in 1858, he gets a group of 30 people together, some of whom are actually freed slaves. So he's arming and equipping black men alongside white men. And their plan is to go to Harper's Ferry down in Virginia, the site of the National Armory, and to basically raid it for its guns, take it over, and then basically try to spark a slave revolt. Now, again, right, is he just trying to do this to make Congress, to make the nation aware of how depraved the situation is, and that this is a question of good versus evil, and the country needs to decide? Or did he actually think that this was going to work? A band of 30 people assaulting a federal armory, and then this would provoke a slave uprising, and God would basically pour His wrath out upon the South. Right? It's hard to say. Either way, John Brown will wage this war against the South. He's going to attack Harper's Ferry. Virginia freaks out. They call together their state militia under a man named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee sends his troops. They corner John Brown. They capture him. They'll try him, and he'll have his day in court, and then they will execute him. Now, when this happens, right, John Brown dies. The South says, "Good riddance," right? We killed a terrorist, somebody who was killing people, right? He was a wanted murderer, right? He participated in this bloodshed in Kansas. He wasn't trying to end the bloodshed. He was trying to win on one side against the other. But this, good riddance, right? Justice done. Virginia's courts worked. But to the north, John Brown starts to become a hero. The transcendentalist poet Ralph Waldo Emerson will compare John Brown to Christ. That the South crucified him, executing him, just like Jesus was put on trial by Pontius Pilate and nailed to a cross as a judicial punishment, right? The court decided against him. So too is John Brown's execution. The court decided against him and hung him. And he was a martyr for the cause of freedom. Now, most people don't take this opinion. Most Northerners are a little bit skeptical, but the sheer fact that the North has people who are influential, wealthy, elite, maybe even members of the Republican Party who are valorizing John Brown is a little scary, to say the least, to the South, right? And so actually a poem, which becomes a very popular song for the Northern armies during the Civil War, called John Brown's Body, starts to spread like wildfire. And in John Brown's Body, the song, the way it goes is, right, John Brown's body's moldering in the grave, right? His body's decomposing, he's in the dirt, but his soul goes marching on. So the point of the song was clear to the South. John Brown may be dead, but his spirit lives on. His fight is not yet won, and that there are others willing to take his place. So again, he dies in 1859, but the South is freaked out, right? North and South seem to be coming apart at the seams. Now, 1860 rolls by. James Buchanan, terrible president, does nothing, useless, and Democrats don't like him. Northern Democrats think he's a total fraud, sellout, he's just a dough-face, so Stephen A. Douglas opposes him. And the South says, look, this union crap, this idea of holding the South together, using the mask of Northerners, right? We're done. No more compromise. In James Buchanan's case, right? He's not even he's like a beard to the Southern government that's running the country, right? The face of the country, is a Northerner. He's from Pennsylvania, but his vice president, John C. Breckinridge, is from Kentucky, and he's actually a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, right? The crazy conspiracy about creating a separate Southern empire. He's actually a member of this, right? High-ranking member. And every other member of Buchanan's government, right, being a Democratic administration, is all appointed from the South. So it really seems like it's North versus South. Buchanan is just a mask. They're just wearing him to kind of pretend like they're interested in the entire country, but the fact that the entire administration is staffed by Southerners seems to suggest the South's interests precede the Union's interests. 1860 rolls by. Republicans are becoming seemingly more aggressive, but Republicans are also aware that they need to win more moderate voters. So they nominate basically a nobody, right? Abraham Lincoln. Nobody knows who this guy is. He's a one-term congressman, right? I mentioned that, right? He served during the 1846, 1848 during the Mexican-American War. He was a Whig. He was a big fan of he was a big fan of Henry Clay. He was a big fan of Andrew Jack or he actually starts to become sort of a fan of Andrew Jackson, but he's a big fan of the Whig Party. When it collapses, he joins with the Republicans. He tries to run for Senate in 1858. He loses to Stephen Douglas, right, in the state of Illinois. So he's kind of a loser, right? He only served one term. He had a kind of decent law practice, but Lincoln was a really good compromiser. He was able to sort of help pull different factions together. So he brought more radical Republicans together. He brought free soil Republicans together. He brought more moderate Republicans together and conservative Democrats, or sorry, conservative Republicans. They all kind of came together and they could back Lincoln, right? Lincoln was acceptable to everyone, right? There's all these factions and Lincoln could bear them all up. He could be their face. But this is too radical for the South. So the South doesn't even include Lincoln on the ballot. You don't even get to choose to vote for Lincoln, right? So he got 0 votes throughout all of the South. But at the same time, the South doesn't know what to do. Some Southerners under Buchanan's his vice president, John C. Breckinridge, they want a obvious pro-South agenda, right? The federal government needs to be on the side of the South. So Breckinridge runs. And this is opposed to the Democratic Party that nominated actually Stephen Douglas. Douglas tries to run. He tries to run on popular sovereignty. He says, right, it screwed up in Nebraska and Kansas, but it will work. It's the right way to go, right? This is the Jacksonian idea. And then you got people who are just sort of stuck in the middle, more moderates in the South, the northern part of the South, who are not linked as heavily to the cotton world. So they're not interested in creating a golden circle empire. They just want the Union to hold together. So they nominate their own candidate, and he does well in the northern South states. So like Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, he does okay there. But all in all, right, the election goes through and Lincoln crushes it. He takes the entire North, and that's all he needs, right? Not on a single Southern ballot, and he wins. Now the South is radicalized by this. There's a number of basically evangelists who go out preaching saying the South has to secede. It must end this alliance with the faithless North that's going to put us in the grave, right? They're going to take away our slaves. They're going to end slavery. Everything will be over, right? We need to do something now. And they're called fire eaters because they're like madmen running around crazy. They're like carnival barkers, right? And they get people really worked up to kind of promote this Southern secessionism. And it works. In South Carolina, right, the seat of John C. Calhoun, the seat of nullification, the first state that really pushes a movement to possibly remove itself from the rest of the United States. And South Carolina has always been on the fence. No offense if you're from South Carolina or you like South Carolina, but that's its history, right? From the very beginning of the Union, from the Declaration of Independence, in the Continental Congress, right? South Carolina has always been a fence sitter. And it's always had to do with the future of its agro-slave trade, right? Whether it was rice in the beginning or cotton later, South Carolina's never been comfortable with any movement that would curtail that trade. So the secession movement really takes off in South Carolina. It succeeds. South Carolina votes. It says we're no longer part of the Union. And so a bunch of, like dominoes, right? South Carolina pops out, then another state pops out, and another, and another, and another, and another, and soon all of the South has seceded. Northern parts of the South are very hesitant, some of whom don't actually leave. So Maryland will stay part of the Union. Part of Virginia will ultimately break off to stay part of the Union, but where the rest of Virginia, which is the last state in the South to secede, right, that's the origins of West Virginia. But secession is now a reality. So Fort Sumter, right, half of the country now is a new country. We'll talk about that in the next lecture, right? It calls itself the Confederacy, or the Confederacy of the United States, or the Confederacy of States, right? The CSA, Confederate States of America, I should say. Let's get my tongue twisted about that. But yeah, it starts its own country. We'll talk more about the actual dynamics of that in the next lecture. But now there are two countries that occupy the former United States. But the problem is that while South Carolina seceded, it did not take federal territory with it. So the federal government can own a piece of land mainly because it's a military outpost. So in this case, Fort Sumter, it's a little island off the coast of Charleston. It's a federal territory, so it still belongs to the United States, not South Carolina, so it didn't technically secede. And it was staffed by Union soldiers. Now, what was Lincoln going to do? This little island fort sitting off the coast of one of the most important southern cities. The first state to secede, Charleston was the home of the hotbed of secessionist activity. And so this is a kind of blow against them. How can we have the Union floating right off, watching us, guns pointed at us, right? This belongs to us. Now, what could Lincoln do, right? They don't want to provoke a war by invading a territory. Lincoln doesn't want to provoke a war. Many people in the Republican administration are basically trying to find a way to undo secession or find a new way to coexist between these two different countries. They're not looking for a civil war. Lincoln's not looking for declaration of war. But Lincoln's also not a coward, right? He learns the lesson from Andrew Jackson that you got to sort of stand your ground. Jackson did not let Calhoun and South Carolina run all over him, even though they're fellow Southerners, right? He put them in their place. And so Lincoln is not going to back down from the threats of South Carolina literally invading part of the United States. Now, this fort needed resupplying, right? It was running out of food and supplies, and Lincoln had a choice. Do I resupply them, or do I give up, allow the South to conquer this territory, and just show that I'm willing to back down, right? Lincoln decides to stay the course. He sends the supply ships. The South interprets this as an attack. The Confederacy issues the right for South Carolina to form a militia. Charleston forms a militia. It marches out, fires on Fort Sumter, captures the fort easily, right? There's not that many soldiers there, but it's a symbolic beginning, right? The South attacked the United States. The Civil War has now begun, right? So just as the electoral map, real quick, so you can see Lincoln doesn't win a single Southern state. Stephen A. Douglas, even though he's the nominee for the Democratic Party, right, he gets some votes in New Jersey, but the only state he wins is Missouri, right, which is kind of fitting because this is basically the site of where all this problem originated. This guy Bell, not important, right? He wins these more northern southern states. And then Breckinridge, who's this pro-South agenda, right? He even wins Maryland and Delaware, but he takes the rest of the South, right? But Lincoln, right? The South doesn't have that many people, right? It's not expanding the same way the North does. So all you need is the North to win, and so that's all Lincoln takes. And so boom, he's president. And I want to conclude with what you can call, right? There's a book written about this called The Scorpion Sting. It's the name of the book. But the question is, right, some scholars have looked at this and said, look, the Republican Party was never really gonna go after the South, right? Free soil was only really about restricting the expansion of slavery to other territories. So what's to stop the South from basically just continuing on, right? They'll keep slaves in Texas, they'll keep slaves in Georgia, they'll keep slaves in Virginia, and it will just be like that forever. So really, was the Republican Party a threat to slavery? Right? Why was this? Right? These Southerners were freaking out. They called Lincoln the Black Republican. They think, they think the Republican Party is going to do all these horrible things, destroy their way of life, free all their slaves, right? And the Republicans never say anything like that. So was it an overreaction? The answer is no. Free soil, right? It was against the expansion of slavery into territories, but it was part of a larger strategy. The idea was that twofold. One, the South needs to keep expanding, right? Cotton is a very selfish plant, right? It drains stuff out of the soil and doesn't really put anything back in. So for these massive cotton plantations, they just suck the life out of the ground. And then you need more land, right? The land needs to heal after so many rounds of cotton. The crop starts to getting less and less and less. So you need access to greater tracts of land so that you can plant cotton there, allow your old land to heal, and then so on the cycle continues, right? So it needs to continue to expand, and if it stops expanding, it will threaten northern investors, right? They're going to say, look, man, I love, making money with you, but you're not making money, so I'm going to put my money somewhere else, right? The kind of proto Wall Street, bankers and types in places like Philadelphia and New York, right? They're going to kind of back out, right? There's more profitable industries than the cotton world. And that was a real fear. That was already starting to happen, right? The North still had some pretty powerful supporters for the South, especially linked to the financial markets of New York and Pennsylvania. There'll be actually a guy named Fernando Wood who will be mayor of New York City, and he'll also be in Congress, and he'll be attacking the 13th Amendment. But right, I mentioned him before. Wood will say very clearly, right, the future of us is with the South, and so we should defend slavery even more than they do. It's crazy, but it makes sense because it makes dollars. It makes dollars and cents. So the point being, they are still heavily invested, but more and more people are pulling out, right? You need to keep expanding if you want to keep attracting investment. You need to show that you're profitable if you want people to keep dumping money into you, right? So the idea of free soil is, look, cut the South off. The South isn't going to expand. And in fact, when you start creating all these new territories that are free states, and they're all profiting, and these southern states are falling apart because they can't keep growing, that the slaveocracy is sort of stalled out in terms of economic proficiency compared to industrialization and various other forms of economics, right? If the South needed to keep going, and they were scrambling to try to figure out how to survive. Now, there's arguments about the South could have conjugated their slavery, right? They could have tried to copy the North's model about production of wheat, so to move out of the cotton world. There's also Southern experiments in trying to use slaves for factory work. So rather than having wage slaves where you pay them literal pennies to do, 14 hours a day work, why don't you just do that with your slave? So there was, possible alternatives. But the free soilers really did believe, and the South really did believe, everyone saw this, that if they could cut the South off from expanding, they would basically ring them off from anything else. And they compare it to this weird analogy where, and this is supposedly, I've never done this, but supposedly it's true. If you take a scorpion and you create a ring of fire around it. So, the example I've seen is you get a scorpion, you put them on a piece of paper, and you light each corner of the paper on fire. Fire's coming towards the scorpion in all directions. It will kill itself. It will take its stinger and inject it into its own head and die. It will commit suicide before the fire gets it. I don't know why. It's very strange. But that's what they thought the South would do, right? If you ring the South around with free states that are profitable, free states that are successful, the South will commit suicide. It will eventually abolish slavery on its own because slavery will just tank out. And there were a lot of Southerners who thought the same thing. They were very much afraid of the same issue. So there is a real case to be made that free soil really was the threat to the advancement of the South, right? Again, free soil, it didn't have these abolition ideas where they wanted a federal law, right? It was going to be a process. It would take time. Also, free soil didn't mean they weren't racist. There were plenty of people who were abolitionists, people who wanted slavery to end because slavery is horrible, but they were also white supremacists, right? They thought the races could not mix. White and black were two different worlds. Black people were inferior, white people were superior. Nevertheless, right, they still are against slavery. So when you investigate these kind of historical subjects, you need to understand the times in which they happen. And you shouldn't just be, expecting everyone to be heroic or, good on the sense that you think people are good, because their values are somewhat different, and you can get good results even from really bad people, right? If you think life is a morality play where good people do good things and everyone is happy and succeeds, and bad people do bad things and everybody's unhappy and the good people beat the bad people and happily ever after, you're not going to really make sense of this, and you're going to be disgusted with most you're going to be disgusted with most political history, but you're not going to really be happy with just about anyone that doesn't reflect the time that you're from. People in the future may have really nasty things to say about people who live today. That doesn't mean we should be all relativistic, that there are no values or virtues or any of that stuff. But you just got to be self-aware, right? If there's universal truth, if there's universal morality, you got to make sense of it playing out within a world that's not made by you, and it's not made by the people who live in it, and they sort of try to make sense of things within that world, right? Was everyone a racist? No. But most people were, and that was the norm. So, you can't expect people to all be extraordinary or abnormal pushing against the times they live in. But Free Soil was truly an anti-slavery movement, and the South really did have um, reasonable cause to be very fearful, and that secession was actually a very rational political move, right? It wasn't this freaking out. Um, that's why all of the elites of the South, right, they're not voting because they support some economic democracy so that every guy could get his own slave, his own piece of land. Of course not. They want to own the majority of it. They're oligarchs. They want to rule by the few, the wealthy, the powerful, and not kind of lock out all the stupid masses from participation, right? They're not pro-democracy, but they know which way the winds are blowing, and so they use this movement to get their own cause advanced. But we're going to get into that more in the next lecture. So, yep, the next lecture is going to be the Civil War. We'll get into all the mess of that, kind of give an outline of the different battles, some of the other things going on. But until then, I'm John Parks. I'm your host. Keep hanging in there, go in peace, and I'll see you next week.